A postcard from an MHB nation, the Republic of Westralia. A nation formed in 1933 after seceding from Australia, two countries sharing one of the longest land borders in the world. Relations are generally cordial, bound by history, by trade, and by standing arm in arm with Australia and little brother New Zealand in multiple wars. The Army Corps becoming known as the Wanzaks. As one of the world's most resource-rich nations, Westralia keeps every dollar of its own tax revenue. Following the example of other resource-rich states, it abolished income tax entirely. Australians often cross the border for seasonal work. Hal Colbatch, the face on all Westralia currency, is revered as the founding father.
Of course, none of that is true. But it very nearly was. What is true is this. In 1933, Western Australia voted to leave the Commonwealth of Australia. 66% voted in favour. The referendum passed. Premier James Mitchell, Sir Hal Colbatch, and many others had argued that the federal government was taking too much, that the deal wasn't fair. It's an argument that was never unique to Western Australia, and it still hasn't gone away.
WA, with its mining royalties, has gotten a lot less.
Brisbane runs, owns, gets everything.
Split Queensland in two.
Those lines drawn on a map.
Well, we've got a good country. I just think it could be better with more states.
Australia's borders have been drawn, redrawn and fought over for a very long time. By ancient owners, by rival empires, by politicians with rulers and maps they'd never walked across. And today, the battle lines are still there. So, who gets to decide what Australia is? October 25th, 1616. A Dutch captain falls to his knees on a windswept beach, exhausted and relieved to be on dry land. His name is Dirk Hartog. His ship has been blown wildly off course, trying to get to Batam in Indonesia. On the hot cliffs above the shore, he hammers a pewter plate into the hot sands, the first European mark on Australian soil. 1616, on the 25th of October, arrived the ship Eendracht of Amsterdam, skipper Dirk Hartog of Amsterdam. He charted the coastline sailing north and concluded he had found a new land. He assumed it was empty. It was not. Long before Europeans began carving straight lines across this continent, Australia was already divided, just not in ways that would ever appear on a colonial map. Hundreds of Aboriginal nations governed this land for more than 60,000 years. Boundaries were recognised and negotiated. Law was enforced. Language marked territory. Kinship defined belonging.
In traditional ways, if you went onto another country, onto other borders without permission, you would be speared. It was punishment by death. That's how secure and important borders were, and were known intimately. And they may not have been marked with roads and fence lines and, acre properties and numbers, but that rock, that tree, that creek, people knew their boundaries intimately.
These were functioning political landscapes. European colonisation would largely ignore all of it, and when it didn't, it usually descended into violence. As it did a decade before Hartog ever set foot on that beach. In 1606, the Wick people saw something they could not explain. White-skinned men travelling up their river in a vessel unlike anything they had seen. Willem Jansch lost crew that day. While we don't know how many Wick were killed or injured, later when other Europeans came to these same shores, it's telling that the Wick were already familiar with guns and already afraid of them.
All they saw was primitive, Stone Age, people who haven't invented this, who haven't done that, and we still hear those things. But I think we're looking at it from a backwards point of view, where we're still using that hierarchy of human interaction, where this Western model is the right model and everything else is going to be measured and against that. But it's not the only model.
These early encounters began to sketch the outline of a map. Jansch thought he'd found an extension of New Guinea. Hartog charted the western coast. Neither understood what they were looking at. In 1644, Abel Tasman sailed much of the western and northern shoreline and gave the land a name, New Holland. But the Dutch were traders, not settlers. The land looked harsh, remote, and commercially worthless. Their claim existed on paper, not on the ground. And a continent that nobody in Europe was willing to occupy was a continent that was open to being claimed. By the 18th century, the race was on. European expeditions were charting coastlines and sizing up imperial footholds across the Pacific, the Americas, and Africa. Australia was just another prize on the board. Britain had its own reasons to move. The American War of Independence had cut off its main dumping ground for convicts. It needed somewhere new to send them. At the same time, naval planners saw the value of a Pacific base, close to Chinese trade routes and a check against French expansion. When Captain James Cook charted the East Coast in 1770 and claimed it for Britain, it gave them the legal pretext. 18 years later, the first fleet arrived. Britain didn't win the continent because it discovered it first. It won because it was the first European power willing to actually stay. And so, on a hot summer's day in January 1788, the lives of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation changed forever. 11 ships, unlike anything they had ever seen, sailed into their sheltered harbour. Over the hours that followed, boatloads of sick, malnourished convicts were rowed ashore and began setting up a makeshift camp. Many were in chains. Soldiers with guns watched the convicts and the Gadigal in equal measure. The Gadigal watched back, curiously, peacefully. This is the day that is celebrated as Australia's beginning. It is not a view shared by everyone. Arthur Phillip's instructions were clear: establish authority. As ownership over fresh water and hunting grounds became a point of tension. But the colony's reach was tiny. New South Wales had been proclaimed with boundaries that stretched on paper across nearly half the continent, westward to the 135th meridian. In reality, British control barely extended beyond Sydney Cove. Sovereignty was about a declaration first. Surveying could come later. And the declaration was far from secure. French expeditions under Nicolas Baudin were charting the southern coastline in the early 1800s, almost simultaneously with British navigator Matthew Flinders. When the two men met at Encounter Bay in 1802, the exchange was cordial. But the message was clear: France was interested. Maps were being drawn, coastlines claimed. The contest for the continent was not over. James Stirling believed Britain needed to lock down the West before somebody else did. When the Swan River Colony was founded in 1829, that's exactly what it achieved. Britain's claim now stretched from coast to coast. The western boundary that still defines Western Australia was later fixed along the 129th meridian, a straight line drawn across a landscape no policymaker had ever seen. Geometry was easier than geography. Over the next 3 decades, the continent kept splitting. South Australia was proclaimed in 1836, a colony designed from scratch. Edward Gibbon Wakefield believed colonization could be engineered: regulated land prices, structured migration, no convicts. Its borders were drawn in London using meridians and parallels across land no one in that room had ever seen. Port Phillip settlers had already been arguing for years that Sydney was too far away and too neglectful to govern them. New South Wales politicians resisted. They didn't want to lose the revenue. Then gold was discovered in Victoria in 1851. That changed everything. Victoria separated from New South Wales. Queensland followed in 1859. John Dunmore Lang had long argued that the northern districts were treated as peripheral by Sydney. Local leaders pushed for autonomy. Same grievance: distance, neglect. Sir George Bowen was installed as the first governor, and another straight line was drawn across unmapped land. Every split had its own characters and circumstances, but the argument underneath was always the same. We're too far away. You're taking too much. You don't understand us. By the late 19th century, 6 colonies were operating independently. Separate parliaments, separate tariffs, even different railway gauges. They could very easily have become 6 countries. Instead, they tried the opposite. It was a time when European rivals were circling the Pacific. Trade between the colonies was strangled by customs duties at every internal border, and many political leaders believed a united nation would carry more weight within the British Empire than 6 squabbling colonies ever could. Henry Parkes began advocating for a federal union in the 1890s, even while the colonies were still fracturing. After a series of conventions and referendums, the Commonwealth of Australia was formally created on the 1st of January 1901. 6 colonies became 6 states within a single federation. The map, for the first time, was supposed to be finished. It wasn't. In 1927, the Northern Territory was split in 2, Central Australia, governed from Alice Springs, North Australia, governed from Darwin. George Pearce believed the territory was simply too vast for one administration. 2 bureaucracies, higher costs, no improvement. By 1931, the experiment was abandoned and the territory was reunited. The map had barely been settled before people started redrawing it again. But the biggest challenge to the map came from the West. Not a redraw, not a tweak. A state tried to leave. During the Great Depression, Premier James Mitchell's nationalist government put the question to a vote. Keith Watson's Dominion League campaigned hard for a yes. Federal tariff policies were crushing the state's export-driven economy. The West was generating wealth. Canberra was taking it. The pressure built, and in 1933, it broke. On the 8th of April, Western Australians voted in a referendum on secession. 66% voted to leave, on a 91% turnout. But here's where it gets strange. Mitchell, who had campaigned for secession, lost the state election held on the same day. The anti-secessionist Labor Party won government and then chose to honour the referendum result anyway. A delegation was sent to London. It was led by Hal Colabach, a former premier and WA's representative in the imperial capital. They petitioned the British Parliament directly, presenting the case in a jar casket. A select committee examined the request. It concluded that following the Statute of Westminster, the British Parliament no longer had the power to act. The people had spoken, 2/3 of them. It made no difference. The vote was real, the mandate was clear, and constitutionally it went nowhere. Western Australia remained. The map held, but only because London said no. But the arguments didn't stop. In the years since, the pressure on the makeup of Australia has continued. David Drummond believed northern New South Wales deserved its own state. After decades of agitation, a referendum was finally held in 1967. It failed. The movement faded. The sentiment didn't. Today, wool broker David Landini is registering a political party to redraw the map. His proposed Riverina state would pull territory from both New South Wales and Victoria. On the Victorian side, Liberal Democrat Tim Quilty made the same argument in his maiden speech in Parliament. They call the movement Rexit. Up in North Queensland, the Katters are still pushing for the 7th state. And in Western Australia, where this story started, a group of lawyers and economists have just published a full blueprint for secession. Not a protest, not a slogan, a detailed legal and economic plan for how WA could become its own country.
If we go it alone, we as a people will be much better off.
Distance, revenue, control. The same 3 arguments every time for over 100 years. Australia's map might look settled, but the question underneath all of it was never really about borders. It was about who gets to decide what Australia is. The Dutch named it and walked away. The French circled. Britain stuck a flag in and started drawing lines. The colonies split apart, then stitched themselves back together on terms not everyone agreed to. Western Australia tried to undo it. 66% of the people agreed. And for Indigenous Australians, sovereignty was never ceded, which is not a radical fringe position. It's the legal reality that terra nullius, land belonging to no one, was overturned by the Mabo decision in 1992. For tens of thousands of years, the borders on this continent were written into the land itself. Everything since has been written on paper.
I think people need to understand it's not about real estate, it's not about property, it's not about wealth. It is far deeper than that. And when we say sovereignty never ceded, it just means these boundaries, these areas, these clans, these ancestral songlines, they remain. And it may be below asphalt and concrete and bridges and roads and cities, but they remain forevermore.